Now, there's a major problem with this class. And let me just quickly show you an example. So if I go down here and I say junior, so that's the instance of person that we created. So an instance of the class, and I can actually access the first name. So you can see I can access the first name, and then I can say, hey, this is my new name now. So I can say new name, right? And then run the program, and that would still work. You can see that it says, your name is your new name or whatever. So this is a major problem because we can actually access the properties on the class, and you usually don't want to do that because this defeats the purpose of encapsulation, because you don't want these to be exposed outside of the class. You want to have a standardized way to access those objects and expose them, or a way to set them. And the reason we're having this problem is because right now, as we have those properties, they're actually public. So it's like we have public in front of these two properties on the class, right? Just like that, which is why I can access this first name outside of the class. You can see this is inside of the class. So if I collapse this, you can see I'm outside of the class and I can still access this first name. So this is a bad design. So what we want is to have those as private. So I'm gonna put private and then change the one down there as well as private. And immediately you can see that I'm getting an error because this is a private field. I can't access it outside of the class the way that I'm doing here. And sometimes you might want to have one way to set properties on the class. For example, when we accept the first name on the constructor like this, I can say, well, I want this to be uppercase or something like that. So I can do like that to uppercase or something. And I might not want anyone else to be able to set the first name on the person any other way. So I need to standardize this. So that's why I don't want someone to be able to access this and then change it. What I want is every time they're trying to set the first name, I want them to go through the constructor the way that we're doing here. So you can see now we're getting this error. And this is usually how you want to build your class, because you don't want the properties in the class to be accessible outside of the class. That is just a bad design, and it just defeats the purpose of the class and object-oriented programming. So now if I run the code, you will see that the code will still work, but the only thing is I can't access those properties in the class outside of the class. And when I'm trying to refer to them inside of the class, I have to use the this keyword to refer to the class itself and then the name of the property. Another thing I want to point out is the properties that we have on this class right here. So usually when you have a class, you're going to have more than two properties, right? So you might have like an email, you might have some image URL, you might have some other properties that you want to have in the class. And every time we have to do the same thing for the constructor, and this is a little bit redundant. So another way you can do this, let me just add another field here just so I can illustrate it a little bit better. So let's say we're going to have an email here, and that's going to be a string. And then we're also going to have another private image URL. So let's say that's the image of the user. And then we're going to give this type of string. Actually, let's make this an ID so that this can make more sense. All right. So let's say the ID is going to be some kind of number or something. So number, and let's fix this. And I'm going to change this to name just to keep it simple, and see if I can move the ID at the top. All right. So we have an ID, we have a name, we have an age, and then we have an email, right? So we have to do the same thing in the constructor. We have to define all these values and then do the assignment for all of them. Now, another way we can do this is by just passing in those values directly inside of the constructor. So I can just go ahead and copy all this and then comment them out. And then here inside of the constructor as parameters, let me see if I can move this over a little bit. I can just pass those in. So I can say this is going to be the first parameter, this is the second parameter, and this is the third parameter, and this is the fourth parameter. And then I can get rid of these. I don't need them anymore. And maybe I'm passing in too many. So let's just remove two of them because I want you guys to be able to see this, and I want to keep this on one line. So let's put this on one line, right? And let's go ahead and comment this out for now, just so we don't get an error. So we're gonna create the class, right? And then we're gonna have the constructor only. So we're not gonna define anything else on the class, right? We're not gonna define any properties here. We're gonna do this in the constructor itself. And this is just a shorthand way to do this. So let's say we're gonna have an ID and then a name, right? So here when I construct a person, I'm just gonna say the ID is a number. So let's say ID is 5, and then the name is Junior, and We don't need this third parameter, and that would work just fine. So what TypeScript is going to do is whenever we pass in the modifiers, that's the key thing in this. You have to pass in a modifier in here. Either if it's going to be public, then you're going to pass in public, or private. So this is just a way that we can give TypeScript some special instruction that we're trying to create those properties as well on the class. So when we pass in the access modifier, as you can see I'm doing here, I'm passing in private, then those properties are also going to be created in the class. So like we're defining up here. So if I were to remove those two just to not confuse you. So doing this in the constructor like this, it's like defining these at the class level, and then do the this.id equal the ID in the constructor, and then this.name in the class equal the name that gets passed in the constructor. So now if I go ahead and do console.log, and then I take a look at the person, which is me, and I'm gonna move this over a little bit and go ahead and run this. You're gonna see that we have the person object, as you can see here. So ID is 5, and then the name is Junior. So this is just a shorthand notation that you can use whenever you're defining your class, because this can get really redundant when you have to type them in the class, and then you have to type the same thing inside of the constructor as parameters, and then you have to set those values in the body of the constructor function. So instead of doing all that, you can just pass in the values inside of the constructor, and that's all you have to do. Like you don't even have to use the this keyword, like this.id equal. You don't have to do none of that. And then when you create your instance of that class, you just pass in the values that the constructor is expecting, and then TypeScript is gonna be able to construct the instance for you using the constructor, and also created those fields on the class itself. And that's usually how I define my classes. Like when I'm working with classes, I just go and create the class, and then I initiate the constructor, and then I pass in the values that I want inside of the class. I never actually use this format when I'm defining a class. So that's just really a shorthand way to do this that you should definitely know. That's probably going to save you some time when you're developing your application.